The sound ripped through the Riverdale precinct like a thunderclap. A single bark, so primal and ferocious that every officer in the building stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Conversations died. Because that bark didn't come from just any K9. It came from Ray. The massive German shepherd paced in the corner kennel, his muscles coiled tight beneath his dark coat, his eyes burning with something between rage and anguish. Whispers followed him everywhere. The beast. The untouchable. The ticking time bomb. His growls vibrated through the concrete walls like an ancient warning nobody dared ignore. Once, Ray had been a legend. The most loyal military K9 overseas, inseparable from his handler, Sergeant Cole Evans. But that was before the IED. Before the explosion that took everything Ray knew. Before the trauma turned him into something nobody recognized. Since his transfer to Riverdale, Ray had become the precinct's darkest secret. He refused every meal. Lunged at every handler who came near. The sound of his snarling could empty a hallway in seconds. Veteran officers with decades of K9 experience backed away, hands raised, eyes wide. "He's too far gone," they whispered. "Nothing can reach him now." Captain Paul had given the final word that morning, 1 week. 7 days to show progress, or Ray would be put down. The paperwork was already drafted. The decision, heartbreaking but necessary. Handler Charles had seen it all before. Dogs broken by war, haunted by loss, but Ray was different. The fury in those dark eyes wasn't hatred. It was heartbreak weaponized. A soldier still fighting a war that had already ended. Every attempt to calm Ray had failed spectacularly. Every training method, every gentle approach, every firm command, nothing worked. Ray had built walls so high that even the most experienced handlers couldn't scale them. He was beyond saving. Beyond hope. Until one quiet Tuesday afternoon. The precinct doors swung open, and a woman walked in with her young daughter. The little girl wore a pink dress that swayed as she moved, a white bow perched in her dark hair. While her mother spoke with the desk sergeant, the child wandered, curious eyes taking in the hallway, the bulletin boards, the strange new world of the police station. And then she heard it. That low, rumbling growl echoing from the K9 wing. Amy Whiteside, barely 5 years old, tilted her head and followed the sound. Officers noticed her drifting toward the restricted area. "Sweetheart, stop," someone called out. "You can't go back there." But Amy didn't stop. Her tiny shoes tapped against the tile floor, each step bringing her closer to the kennel that everyone avoided. Closer to the dog that everyone feared. Charles spotted her first. His heart dropped. No, 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 he sprinted down the hallway, but Amy had already reached Ray's cage. She stood there, small and fearless, her face pressed close to the chain link. Inside, Ray's massive form went rigid. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that had sent grown men running. A growl built in his throat. "Amy," her mother screamed from behind them. "Get away from that dog." But Amy didn't move. She looked straight into Ray's eyes, those tortured, burning eyes, and something impossible happened. The growl died. Ray's ears flicked forward. His head lowered, just slightly. A sound escaped him that nobody had heard in months, a confused, broken whine. "You're not bad," Amy whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the chaos of shouting officers. "You're just scared, huh?" Charles stood frozen, his hand still outstretched, not daring to breathe. Officers lined the hallway behind him, paralyzed with horror and fascination. Amy's small hand reached through the chain link. Ray, the untouchable, the beast, the dog who attacked everyone, took one trembling step forward. Then another. His massive head moved closer to her hand, inch by terrifying inch. What happened next would change everything. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far these incredible stories travel around the world. And if you're already hooked on Ray's journey, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Amy's tiny hand finally touches the most dangerous dog in the city. The K-9 transport van had rolled through the precinct gates 3 weeks earlier, carrying cargo everyone dreaded. Inside, chained and muzzled behind reinforced panels, sat a German shepherd whose reputation had arrived long before he did. The paperwork called him uncontrollable, dangerous, beyond rehabilitation. The handlers who'd transported him had a simpler description: don't get close. Ray's transfer file was 3 inches thick. Military commendations mixed with incident reports. A distinguished service record shadowed by warnings written in red ink. Every page told the same story: a hero turned liability. A loyal soldier transformed into something nobody knew how to handle. As officers unloaded the transport crate, they moved with the caution of bomb disposal technicians. Quick glances. Hushed voices. Nobody wanted this assignment. Nobody wanted to be the one to say goodbye when the week was up. But Charles watched from the observation window as Ray was led into his new kennel, and he saw something the others missed. Behind the rage and the trauma, behind the snapping jaws and the wild eyes, there was something else. A broken heart still beating. A soldier still searching for home. And though Charles didn't know it yet, home was about to walk through the door in a pink dress and change everything forever. Captain Paul stood in the observation corridor, arms crossed, watching the newest arrival through reinforced glass. Ray paced his kennel in tight circles, a caged storm that refused to settle. 3 weeks since transfer, and the dog hadn't improved. If anything, he'd gotten worse. "Officer Charles," Paul called out, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made. "My office." Now. Charles had been studying Ray through the security monitors, watching the patterns in the chaos. The way Ray's ears would flatten at certain sounds. How his pacing would slow near evening, as if muscle memory was searching for a routine that no longer existed. This wasn't just aggression. This was a dog drowning in memories. Paul didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a folder across his desk, Ray's termination authorization inside, waiting only for a signature and a date. "You've worked with trauma cases before. Military dogs, PTSD, the whole deal. But this one's different, Charles. He's not improving. He's a liability we can't afford." Charles picked up the folder but didn't open it. "How long?" "End of the week. Friday. That gives you 4 days to show me something, anything, that proves he's still salvageable." Paul leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "I don't want to do this. You know I don't. But we've had 3 handlers injured trying to assess him. Grant nearly lost his hand last Tuesday. We can't keep rolling those dice. Let me work with him. Charles, he's beyond 1 week. That's all I'm asking. Let me try before we make this permanent." Paul studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 4 days. But if he shows even a hint of progress toward another attack, we're done. I'm not risking anyone else getting hurt over a dog who can't come back from where he's been. Charles spent the rest of that afternoon reviewing Ray's military records. Sergeant Cole Evans had been Ray's handler for 3 years overseas. The commendations painted a picture of perfect partnership: building searches, patrol operations, explosive detection. Ray had saved Evans's unit twice, alerting to hidden IEDs before they could detonate. They'd been inseparable. Until the one IED Ray hadn't detected in time. The explosion had killed Evans instantly. Ray had survived with minor injuries, physically. But something in him had shattered that day, something that medical reports couldn't quantify. The dog who'd once responded to every command with precision now responded to nothing but his own anguish. Charles watched Ray through the monitors as evening settled over the precinct. The dog had stopped pacing, finally, but he hadn't eaten. The food dish sat untouched in the corner, just like yesterday, and the day before. Ray lay in the shadows, head on his paws, eyes fixed on nothing. "You're not a monster," Charles whispered to the screen. "You're just a soldier who lost his way home." But knowing that didn't make the next 4 days any less impossible. Dawn broke cold over Riverdale, and Charles arrived at the precinct before the morning shift. He needed time alone with Ray, away from the nervous whispers and the watching eyes. The K-9 wing was silent except for the soft breathing of sleeping dogs and the hum of ventilation systems. Ray was already awake. He was always awake. Charles approached the kennel slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. Ray's head lifted immediately, ears pinning back, lips curling to reveal teeth. That low growl started, the one that made even veteran handlers step back. "Easy," Charles said softly, stopping 10 feet away. "Nobody's here to hurt you." Ray's growl deepened. His entire body tensed, coiled springs waiting to release. Charles had seen this dance before in other war dogs, the moment before violence, before fear transformed into fury. But Charles didn't move. He sat down on the concrete floor, making himself smaller, less threatening. Ray's eyes tracked the movement, confused by this handler who refused to follow the script. "I read about you and Cole," Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years together. That's longer than most marriages last. You saved his unit twice. Found those IEDs before they could kill anyone." He paused. "But you couldn't find the last one. And now you're stuck in that moment, aren't you? Still searching. Still trying to save him." Ray's growl faltered, just for a second. His eyes, those dark, burning eyes, held something Charles recognized from his own mirror on bad nights. Guilt. The kind that ate you alive from the inside out. "It wasn't your fault," Charles said. "You know that, right? Whatever happened over there, whatever you think you should have done differently, it wasn't your fault." Ray turned away, facing the wall. Dismissing him. Retreating into the darkness where words couldn't follow. Charles stayed there for an hour, speaking occasionally, mostly sitting in silence. Ray never looked back. Never acknowledged his presence beyond that initial threat. But he didn't attack either. Small victories counted when you had 4 days to achieve the impossible. Over the next 2 days, Charles established a routine. Morning visits before the precinct woke up. Evening sessions after everyone else had left. He'd sit outside Ray's kennel, talking about nothing and everything. About Cole, about the war, about the long road home that some soldiers never quite finished walking. Ray tolerated him. Nothing more. The dog still refused food, still paced his cage like a prisoner counting down his final days. Because that's exactly what he was. Wednesday morning, Charles tried something different. He brought Ray's file with him, spreading the papers on the floor. Military photos, commendation letters, training records. And there, near the bottom, a personal photograph that had somehow made it into the official documentation. Cole Evans in his fatigues, kneeling beside Ray in some desert outpost. The handler's arm draped over the dog's shoulders, both of them squinting into harsh sunlight. Cole was smiling, and if dogs could smile, Ray was too. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood a woman holding a small child in a pink dress. Charles stared at the photo for a long time. Something about it nagged at him, some detail his mind was trying to surface. But before he could identify it, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Grant appeared, his right hand still bandaged from Ray's attack. "Captain wants an update. Tell him we're making progress." Grant glanced at Ray, who hadn't moved from his corner. "That's progress? He's still alive, isn't it?" Thursday afternoon arrived with the weight of a countdown timer. 24 hours until Paul made his final decision, and Ray showed no signs of breakthrough. Charles had barely slept, his mind circling the same impossible problem: how do you reach a dog who'd built walls higher than anyone could climb? The precinct was busy with shift change when Grant decided to make one last attempt. Charles had stepped away for coffee, 5 minutes, maybe less, but it was enough. Grant approached Ray's kennel with a catchpole and misplaced confidence. "Come on, boy. Let's show them you're not all bad." Ray's response was immediate and explosive. He launched himself at the chain link with such force that the entire kennel frame shuddered. Grant stumbled backward, the catchpole clattering to the floor. Ray's teeth snapped inches from the metal barrier, saliva flying, his roar filling the entire wing. Officers came running. Charles dropped his coffee cup, sprinting down the hallway. He found Grant on the ground, scrambling away from the kennel while Ray threw himself repeatedly against the fence. The sound of metal straining echoed like gunshots. "What the hell were you thinking?" Charles grabbed Grant's arm, pulling him further back. "I was trying to help. Captain said to let me handle it." Charles's voice cut through the chaos. Ray was beyond reason now, beyond reach. All the careful progress of the last 3 days evaporated in seconds. Captain Paul appeared at the end of the hallway, his face grim. He surveyed the scene, the overturned equipment, Grant's terrified expression, Ray's continued assault on his enclosure, and Charles watched the decision crystallize in his captain's eyes. "My office. Both of you. Now." Charles took one last look at Ray. The dog had stopped attacking but remained pressed against the fence, every muscle trembling with adrenaline and rage. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Charles saw it again. That flash of something beyond the fury. A plea, maybe. Or an apology. Paul closed his office door with the finality of a coffin lid. "I've been patient, Charles. Given you time. But this is exactly what I was afraid of. He's not improving. He's a danger to everyone in this building. Grant shouldn't have." Grant did what any handler would do. Tried to assess the animal. And Ray tried to tear his throat out through a chain-link fence. Paul pulled out the termination paperwork, now filled out except for the execution date. "Tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. "I'm sorry, Charles. I really am. But we're out of time and out of options." Charles stood there, holding that folder, feeling the weight of a life reduced to bureaucracy and signatures. 4 days had become 4 hours. The impossible had become inevitable. "I need to be there," Charles said quietly. "When it happens. He shouldn't be alone." Paul nodded. "Of course." Charles walked back to the K-9 wing as evening settled over Riverdale. The other dogs were being fed, but Ray's dish would remain untouched, as always. Charles sat outside the kennel one last time, trying to find words that mattered. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I thought I could reach you. Thought I could find a way through. But maybe some walls are meant to stay up. Maybe some soldiers can't come home." Ray lay in his corner, head on paws, watching Charles with those dark, unreadable eyes. If dogs could understand death sentences, Charles wondered if Ray would be relieved. An end to the war. An end to the searching. The precinct doors opened somewhere in the building. Voices drifted down the hallway, civilians checking in at the front desk. Charles barely noticed. His mind was already on tomorrow morning, on the drive to the veterinary clinic, on the moment when Ray's eyes would finally close for good. He didn't know that salvation was walking through those doors right now. He didn't know that home had finally come looking for its lost soldier. The woman at the front desk was explaining something about a traffic citation when her daughter wandered away. The precinct was fascinating to 5-year-old eyes, so many uniforms, so many interesting doors, so many sounds echoing through unfamiliar hallways. Amy Whiteside's pink dress swished as she walked, her white bow slightly crooked from the car ride. She wasn't supposed to wander, but the building was like a maze, and mazes were meant to be explored. Her small shoes tapped against tile, each step taking her further from her mother's voice. Then she heard it. That sound that froze officers in their tracks. To Amy, it was just a dog. A sad dog, maybe, by the sound of it. She tilted her head, curious, and followed the echo down a corridor marked with signs she couldn't read yet. Officer Davis spotted her first. "Hey, sweetheart. You can't go back there." His voice carried alarm, but Amy was already committed to her path. The sound was getting louder now, more distinct. Definitely a dog. Charles heard the commotion before he saw the source. Adult voices calling out warnings, footsteps running. He stood up from his position outside Ray's kennel just as a small figure rounded the corner. The world seemed to slow down. Amy stopped at the chain-link barrier, her face level with Ray's. Inside the kennel, the massive German shepherd had risen to his feet, that familiar growl building in his chest. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that had sent grown men fleeing. "Amy!" The mother's scream cut through the precinct like a siren. Officers converged from multiple directions, but nobody dared get too close. One wrong move, one sudden sound, and this situation could turn catastrophic. Charles moved on instinct, positioning himself between the crowd and the kennel, his hand raised for silence. His heart hammered against his ribs. For days of careful work, all culminating in this moment, a child's life hanging in the balance with a dog scheduled for termination in less than 12 hours. But then something impossible happened. Ray's growl died in his throat. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, rotated forward. His head lowered, not in threat, but in something else entirely. Confusion. Recognition. His massive body, coiled for violence just seconds ago, seemed to deflate. A sound escaped him that Charles had never heard before, a high-pitched, broken whine that spoke of longing and disbelief. Amy pressed her face closer to the fence, unbothered by the chaos behind her, unconcerned with the teeth that could end her life in seconds. She looked directly into Ray's eyes, those tormented, haunted eyes. And smiled. "You're not bad," she whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "You're just scared, huh?" Ray took one trembling step toward her. Then another. His entire body shook with something that looked almost like recognition, like a dream he couldn't quite believe was real. Amy's small hand reached through the chain-link opening. Charles's breath caught. Officers behind him tensed, ready to rush forward. Amy's mother stood paralyzed with horror and helplessness. Ray's massive head moved closer to that tiny, outstretched hand. Inch by impossible inch. His eyes never left Amy's face, searching for something, confirming something that only he could understand. And then, with a gentleness that defied everything anyone knew about this dog, Ray pressed his nose against Amy's palm. The precinct erupted in shocked whispers, but Charles barely heard them. He was watching a miracle unfold, watching walls crumble that everyone had declared unbreakable. Ray's eyes closed as Amy's fingers found his fur, scratching behind his ears with the fearless affection of a child who saw no monsters, only friends. "Good boy," Amy murmured. "Such a good boy." Ray's tail, which hadn't moved in months except in anger, gave one small, uncertain wag. Charles pulled out his phone with shaking hands, capturing this moment. Not as evidence. Not as documentation. But as proof that sometimes hope arrives in the most unlikely forms, wearing a pink dress and believing in second chances. Amy's mother finally found her voice, rushing forward to pull her daughter back. But Amy resisted, looking up at the adults with confusion. Why is everyone scared? He's nice. As they gently guided Amy away from the kennel, Ray watched her go with eyes that held something Charles hadn't seen in 4 days. Something that looked almost like peace. When Amy disappeared around the corner, Ray released a sound, half whine, half whimper, that broke every heart in that hallway. Charles stood frozen, his mind racing. That reaction. That immediate recognition. Ray didn't just tolerate that child. He knew her. But how? He pulled up the security footage on his tablet, watching the scene replay from multiple angles. Then he went to his office and retrieved that photograph from Ray's file. Cole Evans kneeling beside Ray, the woman and child barely visible in the background. The pink dress. The dark hair. The same gentle smile. Charles's hands trembled as realization crashed over him. He practically ran back to the front desk, catching Amy's mother before she could leave. "Ma'am? I need to ask you something. That photograph in Ray's file, is that you?" The woman's face went pale as Charles showed her the image on his phone. Her hand moved to her mouth. That's Cole. My husband. That's us in Afghanistan, when Amy was just a baby. I'd forgotten he kept that picture with," her voice broke. "With Ray." Amy tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Can I see the doggy again? He remembers me, Mommy. He remembers." Charles looked at Captain Paul, who had witnessed everything. The termination order was still scheduled for 8 a.m. But in the span of 5 minutes, a child in a pink dress had accomplished what 4 days of expert handling couldn't. She'd brought a soldier home. The precinct felt different after Amy left. Officers who'd given Ray a wide berth for weeks now lingered near his kennel, whispering about what they'd witnessed. Ray himself had changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. The constant pacing had stopped. He lay near the front of his enclosure, head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the corridor where Amy had disappeared. Charles sat in the observation room, watching the security footage for the 7th time. The way Ray's entire demeanor had shifted the instant he saw Amy. The gentleness in his movements. The recognition so profound it was almost painful to witness. Captain Paul stood in the doorway, arms crossed. So the dog knew the kid. Not just knew her, Captain. Look at this. Charles pulled up the old photograph, then footage of Amy from today, side by side. Amy Whiteside. Daughter of Sergeant Cole Evans. Ray's handler for 3 years overseas. The handler who died. Ray was there when it happened. Probably thought he'd lost everything. Charles gestured to the monitor showing Ray's kennel. And today, part of his family walked back into his life. Paul was quiet for a long moment, studying the screens. The termination order. Has to be cancelled. Sir, we just watched a dog everyone called untouchable let a child touch him. That's not a lost cause. That's a dog who needed a reason to come back. Charles, one good moment doesn't erase 3 weeks of aggression. Then let me prove it wasn't just a moment. Give me more time. Let Amy visit again. Paul exhaled slowly, the weight of command evident in every line of his face. You're asking me to gamble on a traumatized war dog because a 5-year-old managed to calm him down once. I'm asking you to believe in what we both just saw. The captain pulled out his phone, making a decision that Charles could see forming behind his eyes. I'll call the mother. If she's willing to bring Amy back, and if Ray shows consistent improvement, we'll revisit the termination. But Charles, one slip, one moment of aggression toward that child, and this is over. Understood? Understood. Sarah Whiteside answered on the third ring. Her voice carried the tremor of someone processing impossible information. Captain Paul. I've been sitting in my car trying to figure out if what just happened was real. Mrs. Whiteside, I need to ask you something that might sound unusual. Would you be willing to bring Amy back to visit Ray? Under controlled circumstances, with handlers present. The line went silent for several heartbeats. That dog, Ray, he knew my daughter. He did. He does. We believe seeing Amy has had a profound effect on him. Cole talked about Ray constantly. In his letters, in our video calls. Ray was family to him. Her voice broke slightly. After Cole died, I couldn't bear to ask what happened to Ray. Couldn't handle one more loss. He's been lost, Mrs. Whiteside. But I think your daughter just helped him find his way back. Would you consider it? Another pause. Then, Amy hasn't stopped talking about the nice doggy since we got to the car. She wants to visit him tomorrow. Says he's lonely. Charles felt something unclench in his chest. Tomorrow would be perfect. That evening, Charles stayed late at the precinct. He brought Ray's dinner himself, setting the bowl just inside the kennel door. Ray watched him with less suspicion than usual, though he made no move toward the food. She's coming back, Charles said softly. Amy. Tomorrow afternoon. So maybe you should eat something, let her see you're taking care of yourself. Ray's ears twitched at Amy's name. His tail gave a small, hesitant movement. You remember her growing up, don't you? Cole probably showed you pictures, talked about her all the time. His little girl. And now she's not so little anymore, and she walked right up to you like you weren't the scariest thing in this building. Charles smiled despite himself. She sees who you really are. Who you were before everything went wrong. Ray stood slowly, moving toward the food bowl. He sniffed it cautiously, then took a small bite. Then another. It wasn't much, but it was the first voluntary meal he'd taken since arriving at Riverdale. Charles pulled out his phone, snapping a photo. Small victories. They were building something here, one impossible moment at a time. Friday afternoon arrived with autumn sunlight streaming through the precinct windows. Amy walked in holding her mother's hand, wearing yellow today instead of pink, her face bright with anticipation. Officers stepped aside, giving them space, everyone aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. Ray was standing at his kennel door when they rounded the corner. Not pacing, not growling. Just waiting, as if he'd known exactly when she'd arrive. Hi, puppy. Amy released her mother's hand, walking forward with the fearlessness unique to children who haven't learned to be afraid. I came back to see you. Ray's tail wagged, a real wag this time, sweeping side to side with genuine joy. He pressed against the chain link, that soft whine building in his throat again. Charles opened the kennel door slowly, carefully. Amy, I'm going to let you inside, but you need to move slowly, okay? Let Ray come to you. Sarah moved to protest, but Charles raised a hand. I'll be right here. But Ray needs to know he can trust this, that Amy isn't going to disappear again. Amy stepped into the kennel like she was entering a friend's house. Natural, unafraid, already talking to Ray in that gentle, rambling way children do. My mommy says you knew my daddy. He's in heaven now. Do you miss him? I miss him too. But it's okay to be sad. Mommy says being sad means we loved somebody a lot. Ray moved toward her, each step deliberate and careful. When he reached Amy, he lowered his massive head and pressed it against her small chest. Amy wrapped her arms around his neck, and Ray closed his eyes, releasing a sound that was part whimper, part sigh, the sound of something broken finally beginning to heal. Charles watched through the camera, documenting everything, knowing Captain Paul was monitoring from his office. This wasn't just progress. This was transformation. "You're so soft," Amy murmured into Ray's fur. "And you're not scary at all. You're just sad. But that's okay. We can be sad together." They stayed like that for 20 minutes, child and dog, connected by a ghost they both loved. When Sarah finally said it was time to leave, Amy hugged Ray one more time. "I'll come back tomorrow. Promise." Ray watched her go, but this time when she disappeared, he didn't whimper in despair. He turned to Charles and, for the first time since arriving at Riverdale, sat on command. "Good boy," Charles whispered, his throat tight. "Such a good boy." The weekend brought routine. Amy visited Saturday and Sunday, each session longer than the last. By Sunday evening, she was sitting in Ray's kennel reading picture books aloud while Ray rested his head in her lap, content in a way Charles had thought impossible. But something nagged at Charles. That photograph from Ray's file, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Monday morning, he requested Ray's complete military records, not just the transfer documents. What arrived was a box of memories. Training certifications, deployment photos, personal effects that had somehow followed Ray through channels. And there, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag, was a weathered photograph. Different from the one in the file. This one showed Cole in civilian clothes, kneeling in what looked like a backyard, one arm around Ray and the other around a toddler in overalls. On the back, written in careful handwriting, "Ray, Daddy's brave partner. Love, Amy." Charles stared at those words for a long time. Amy had been part of Ray's life from the beginning. No wonder the dog had recognized her. No wonder he'd calmed at her presence. She wasn't just a child who reminded him of better times, she was family. The family he'd lost and never expected to find again. He brought the photograph to Sarah during Amy's Monday visit. She stood outside Ray's kennel, watching her daughter laugh as Ray gently nosed a tennis ball toward her, his movements careful and controlled. "Mrs. Whiteside, I found this in Ray's personal effects." Charles handed her the photograph. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at it. "I remember this. It was Amy's second birthday. Cole had leave, just 4 days, but he insisted Ray come home with us. Said Ray was part of the family." Tears slipped down her cheeks. Amy doesn't remember much about Cole. She was so young when he deployed that last time. But she remembers Ray. She's talked about Daddy's big doggy for years. "I thought they were just toddler memories, mixed up with dreams." They weren't dreams. Ray was her family. She was his. Inside the kennel, Amy had convinced Ray to lie down so she could use his side as a pillow. Ray's tail thumped against the concrete, his eyes half closed in contentment. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "When Amy stops visiting? Will he go back to how he was?" Charles had been thinking about that question for days. "I think Ray needs more than visits. He needs what he lost. He needs home." "You're saying?" "I'm saying Ray belongs with Amy. With your family. If you'd be willing." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Ray, her expression complicated with grief and hope tangled together. "Cole would have wanted that. He made me promise, if anything happened to him, that I'd take care of Ray. But I thought Ray died overseas too. The army never contacted me about him. Bureaucracy and trauma. Ray got lost in the system." Charles pulled out the adoption paperwork he'd prepared, just in case. "But we can fix that now. Ray's already proven he's not the aggressive dog everyone thought. With Amy, he's perfect. Gentle, controlled, protective. I have a daughter to think about. What if something triggers him? Then I'll be there. I'll work with him, with your family. We'll make sure Ray transitions properly. Charles met her eyes. Mrs. Whiteside, that dog in there has been waiting 3 years to come home. Amy walked into his life and gave him a reason to try. Don't let him lose that again. Sarah watched Amy through the chain link. Her daughter was singing now, some made-up song about dogs and stars. Ray's eyes were closed, his breathing slow and even. Cole always said Ray saved his life more times than he could count. Maybe it's time we saved Ray's. She took the paperwork. The adoption process would take weeks, home visits, evaluations, training sessions. But Captain Paul signed off on it immediately after reviewing the footage of Ray's transformation. The dog who'd been scheduled for termination was now scheduled for a forever home. Charles brought Amy and Sarah to the precinct every day that week. Ray's progress was remarkable. He responded to commands again, ate regularly, even tolerated other handlers approaching his kennel as long as Amy was nearby. It was as if her presence had flipped a switch, reminding him how to be a dog again instead of a broken soldier. Friday evening, Charles stayed late reviewing the week's security footage. Ray had come so far so fast. Maybe too fast. Something about it felt fragile, like they'd put a bandage on a wound that needed surgery. His phone buzzed. Weather alert. Severe storms expected overnight, possibility of flooding in low-lying areas. Charles glanced at the monitors. Ray was resting peacefully in his kennel, probably dreaming of Amy's next visit. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall. He didn't know that somewhere across town, Amy was asking her mother if they could visit Ray tomorrow, even though it was supposed to storm. Didn't know that Sarah was saying yes, they'd go first thing in the morning. Didn't know that by morning, everything would change. The storm hit Riverdale at 2 in the morning with the fury of something apocalyptic. Thunder cracked like artillery fire. Lightning turned night into stuttering daylight. Rain hammered against the precinct windows hard enough to sound like gravel being thrown. In his kennel, Ray woke instantly, his entire body going rigid. The thunder, it sounded wrong. Familiar. Like explosions echoing across desert valleys. Like the world ending in fire and noise. He was back there. In the convoy. In the moment before everything shattered. Ray's breathing accelerated, his heart hammering against his ribs. The walls of his kennel became the walls of the transport vehicle. The thunder became IED detonations. Cole's voice echoed in his memory, calling commands Ray could no longer follow because Cole was. Ray lunged at the kennel door with the strength of pure panic. Once. Twice. The latch, already worn from weeks of aggression, gave way on the third impact. Metal shrieked as the door flew open. The night officer on duty heard the crash and ran toward the K-9 wing, but Ray was already gone, bolting through the precinct like a ghost, finding an emergency exit someone had propped open during a smoke break. Into the storm. Into the darkness. Into the memory that wouldn't let him go. Charles's phone exploded with calls at 2:15. He answered mid-ring, already pulling on clothes. What happened? Ray's gone. Broke out during the storm. We've got units searching but I'm on my way. Charles drove through rain so heavy his wipers couldn't keep up, his mind racing through possibilities. Ray was out there somewhere, lost in trauma, running from demons only he could see. In this weather, he could be anywhere. Could hurt someone. Could hurt himself. His phone rang again. Sarah Whiteside. His stomach dropped. Charles, "I'm sorry to call so late but Amy," she woke up screaming. "Says Ray's scared and lost and she needs to help him. I know it sounds crazy but she's insistent and—" Thunder cracked through the phone line, drowning out her words. When the sound cleared, Sarah was saying, "Near the East Bridge. Amy keeps saying he's by the bridge. She's begging me to take her. Stay home. It's not safe in this weather. I'll check the bridge." But even as he said it, Charles was turning his car toward East Bridge Road, something in his gut telling him Amy was right. However, she knew. The bridge was chaos. Water rushed high and fast beneath it, debris clogged and dangerous. A car sat stalled in the middle of the road, hazards flashing weakly through the downpour. Charles's headlights caught movement, someone standing outside the vehicle, waving frantically. Sarah Whiteside. And beside her, barely visible in the storm, Amy in her yellow raincoat. "What are you doing here?" Charles shouted over the wind as he ran toward them. "I told you to stay home. Our car stalled." And Amy said. She said Ray was coming. A bark cut through the storm. Deep, desperate, urgent. Ray materialized from the darkness like he'd been summoned, his coat soaked, his eyes wild but focused. Not on Charles. On Amy. He barked again, moving toward the tree line, then back toward them. Barking. Insistent. "He wants us to follow him," Amy said with absolute certainty. "Mommy, we have to go. Someone needs help." "Amy, no." But Ray was already moving, and Amy slipped from her mother's grasp, following the dog into the woods that bordered the road. "Amy!" Sarah screamed. Charles didn't hesitate. He plunged after them, his flashlight beam cutting through rain and darkness. Ray was ahead, visible only in flashes, Amy somehow keeping pace with the massive dog. The ground was treacherous, mud sliding beneath their feet, branches whipping at their faces. Then Charles heard it. A creaking, groaning sound that meant something was about to give way. They burst into a small clearing just as the earth began to collapse. A ravine, invisible in the darkness, its edges undermined by rushing water. Amy was too close, too focused on following Ray to see the danger. "Amy, stop." Charles lunged forward, but he was too far away. The ground gave way beneath Amy's feet. Everything happened in fragments. Amy's scream. The sound of earth crumbling. Sarah's voice somewhere behind them, raw with terror. And Ray moved with the precision of the military K-9 he'd once been. No hesitation. No trauma. Just instinct and purpose and love. He launched himself forward as Amy slid, his jaws catching the back of her raincoat before she could fall into the ravine. The fabric held for one crucial second, long enough for Ray to pull back, his powerful neck muscles straining as he dragged Amy away from the collapsing edge. Charles reached them, grabbing Amy and pulling her to solid ground. But the momentum had carried Ray too close to the unstable earth. The dog scrambled for purchase, his claws digging into mud that wouldn't hold. Above them, a tree that had stood for decades finally surrendered to the storm. It fell with a sound like the world breaking, branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. Ray saw it coming. Charles saw in the dog's eyes that he knew. But instead of dodging, instead of saving himself, Ray positioned his body between the falling tree and where Amy lay gasping in Charles's arms. The impact was sickening. The tree's trunk caught Ray across his back and shoulder, driving him into the mud. A yelp of pain cut through the storm, then silence except for the rain. "Ray!" Amy's scream was primal. She fought against Charles's grip, trying to reach the dog. Charles couldn't see how badly Ray was hurt, but the way the dog lay motionless beneath the branch was answer enough. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking, calling for emergency services. For backup. For anyone who could help. Sarah reached them, pulling Amy into her arms, both of them crying. Charles moved to the tree, trying to assess if he could lift it, if Ray was even still. A whimper. Weak, barely audible, but there. Ray, Charles called softly. Stay with me, buddy. Help is coming. It took 3 officers and emergency equipment to lift the tree safely. When they finally pulled Ray free, his right side was torn, blood mixing with mud and rain. His breathing was labored, his eyes half closed. But when Amy's face appeared in his line of sight, Ray's tail moved. Just once. A small thump against the ground. You saved me, Amy whispered, her small hand finding Ray's head. You saved me, Ray. The nearest emergency veterinary hospital was 20 minutes away. Charles drove like the road was his alone, Ray wrapped in blankets in the back seat, Sarah holding pressure on the worst of his wounds while Amy held the dog's paw. Stay, Ray, Amy kept saying. Stay. You have to stay. Dr. Martinez met them at the emergency entrance, her team already prepped from Charles's call. They wheeled Ray inside on a gurney, moving fast, professional voices calling out medical terms Charles only half understood. Severe lacerations, possible internal bleeding, compromised breathing. He's stable but critical. Get him to surgery now. The doors closed behind them, leaving Charles, Sarah, and Amy in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Amy sat pressed against her mother's side, her yellow raincoat dripping onto the linoleum, her face pale. He can't die, she said quietly. Mommy, he can't die. He just came back. Sarah had no answer. She just held her daughter and stared at those closed doors. Charles paced, replaying everything. Ray had broken out of the precinct in a PTSD episode, run blindly into the storm, and somehow found Amy. Had saved her. Had taken the hit himself rather than let anything happen to Cole's daughter. Not just a dog remembering his family. A soldier completing his mission. Protecting what mattered most, even at the cost of everything. 3 hours passed like 3 days. Sunrise came gray and weak through the hospital windows, the storm finally breaking. Dr. Martinez emerged at 7:30, still in surgical scrubs, her face unreadable. Charles stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Sarah clutched Amy tighter. He's alive, Dr. Martinez said, and the relief that flooded the room was almost physical. It was close. Very close. The trauma was extensive, broken ribs, severe lacerations, significant blood loss. But he's strong. Stronger than any dog I've operated on. Can we see him? Amy asked, her voice small. He's in recovery. Still sedated. But yes, you can see him. Ray lay on a padded table in the ICU, his right side wrapped in bandages, and 4-line running into his front leg. His breathing was steady but shallow. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way he'd never appeared even in his worst moments at the precinct. Amy approached slowly, her hand reaching out to touch Ray's paw. Hi, puppy. You're so brave. The bravest dog ever. Ray's eyes flickered open, unfocused and heavy with medication. But they found Amy's face and held there. His tail, barely visible beneath the blankets, moved. Just once. He knows you're here, Dr. Martinez said softly. That's good. That's very good. Charles stood back, watching this child and this dog, connected by loss, by love, by a soldier who'd made them both promises. Ray had kept his promise to Cole. Protected his daughter. Brought himself back from the edge of darkness because she needed him. Now they just needed him to survive. Recovery was slow. Ray spent 4 days in the veterinary ICU before he was stable enough to transfer back to a kennel, not at the precinct, but at Charles's home, where Amy could visit freely and Ray could heal in peace. The first week, Ray barely moved. The pain medication kept him drowsy, and the injuries made every breath an effort. But Amy came every day after school, sitting beside his bed, reading stories and telling him about her day. Ray's eyes would track her movements, his tail giving small, weak thumps whenever she touched him. "The doctors say you're healing really well," Amy told him one afternoon, her hand gentle on his head. "You're a fighter. Daddy would be so proud of you." Charles watched from the doorway, documenting Ray's progress. The physical wounds would heal. But something else was healing too. Something deeper. Ray no longer flinched at loud sounds. Didn't pace when left alone. The trauma hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip, replaced by something stronger. Purpose. Family. Home. 2 weeks post-surgery, Ray stood on his own for the first time. Shaky, favoring his injured side, but standing. Amy clapped and cheered like he'd just won a medal. Ray's tail wagged properly then, sweeping side to side despite the obvious discomfort. "That's my good boy," Amy said, hugging his neck carefully. "You're going to be okay. We're all going to be okay." By week 3, Ray was walking outside, short trips around Charles's yard with Amy beside him. His strength returned gradually, each day bringing more mobility, less pain, more of the dog he was meant to be. Captain Paul visited one afternoon, watching Ray and Amy play a gentle game of fetch with a soft toy. "Hard to believe that's the same dog who broke out of the precinct." "It's not," Charles said. "That dog was lost. This one found his way home." The official ceremony happened 2 months after the storm. The Riverdale City Precinct organized a commendation event, inviting press and community members. Ray stood on the precinct steps, still favoring his right side slightly, wearing a ceremonial collar and badge. Captain Paul read the citation. "For extraordinary bravery and selfless service, Ray, formerly of the United States Military K-9 Corps, is hereby awarded the Riverdale Police Department Medal of Honor and designated an honorary officer of the Riverdale City Police." The crowd applauded. News cameras flashed. But Ray only had eyes for Amy, who stood beside him in her favorite pink dress, holding his leash and beaming with pride. "This dog reminded us what service really means," Paul continued. "Loyalty beyond duty. Love beyond trauma. Courage beyond measure. Ray saved a life at nearly the cost of his own. There is no higher honor we can bestow." After the ceremony, Sarah signed the final adoption papers. Ray was officially, legally, permanently part of their family. They drove home together, Sarah, Amy, and Ray, to a house that Ray had been to only once before, years ago, when Cole had brought him home on leave. But Ray remembered. As they pulled into the driveway, his ears perked up. He knew this place. Knew the scent of it, the feel of it. Home. Amy led Ray inside, showing him around like a tour guide. "This is the living room, and this is where your bed is going to be, right next to the couch so you can always be close. And this is the kitchen where Mommy makes really good cookies, and she'll probably let you have some even though she says she won't." Ray followed her from room to room, his tail wagging continuously. When they reached Amy's bedroom, she pushed open the door to reveal a space filled with stuffed animals and books and drawings. On the wall hung a photograph. Cole in uniform, young and smiling, one hand resting on Ray's head. Below it, Amy had written in crayon, "My Daddy and Ray. Forever family." Ray stared at the photo for a long moment, his tail slowing. Sarah came up behind him, her hand gentle on his head. "He loved you so much," she said softly. "Talked about you all the time. You were his partner, his friend, his family. And now you're ours. You're home, Ray. Finally home. That night, Ray slept in Amy's room, his bed positioned beside hers so she could reach down and touch him if she wanted. As darkness settled and Amy's breathing evened into sleep, Ray lay awake, his eyes on the photograph on the wall. He'd lost Cole. Had lost everything he knew in one terrible moment of fire and noise. Had spent years lost in trauma, fighting battles that had already ended, searching for a home that seemed gone forever. But Amy had walked into his darkness wearing a pink dress and refusing to see a monster. Had seen instead what he'd forgotten he could be: loyal, gentle, brave. Had reminded him that love doesn't end with death. That family endures. That soldiers can come home, even when the road seems impossible. Ray's tail thumped softly against his bed. Above him, Amy's small hand dangled over the edge of her mattress, her fingers tangled in his fur even in sleep. Home. Finally, impossibly, miraculously home. And for the first time in 3 years, Ray closed his eyes and slept without nightmares.